So your feeling is that when you excite the circuitry there, the signals have always been coming down, but just not strong enough to activate it?
Yeah.
Or do you think maybe signals are actually getting to it that weren't before?
Yeah, so it could be both. It could be either or both. I think that, well, the fact that something happens immediately would support the idea that the signals are there, but the circuitry is not in an sufficient excitable state to respond to them, right? And then the fact that the behavior improves over time, and you can do more sophisticated movements, and then you go from being able to do things better or not independently would tell you that you're driving different types of plasticity. So I think both are true. I think that probably what's happening is that new connections are being made. I mean, we know the brain is plastic. The spinal corpus is plastic too. I think that, and we also know there's many experiments. Like I remember this really classic experiment in an owl, like in the early 90s, where they put a patch over the owl, and then these neurons in the brain went and did something else, and then they took the patch on and they came back and controlled the eye again. So I think that there's probably new pathways that get made once the spinal cord gets active. So I think what's happened to these individuals is they're put in wheelchairs, they're given drugs to shut down the spinal cord, so the neurons, they're maladaptive changes, and then you activate them with the spinal cord, we're training them, we're doing all these things, and then there's plasticity towards whatever task you're doing.
Right, so learning and plasticity are driven by use, but since they can't use it, that doesn't happen, but you've made it so they can, so
now it gets driven towards whatever task, and I think the standing experiment supports that, the fact that they got independent standing, and then when we stopped it, they lost it, right? So I think, and we didn't really mean to do that. I mean, we really didn't, and in fact, we should have known better, because there's a cat study that shows that. So they trained in this step, and then they purposely trained him to stand, and they lost the ability to step. So we knew that should have happened, but we really didn't mean for it to happen. We were really kind of sadly surprised and a little panicked when it happened, but we're really happy when we could get them to stand again.
So you were talking about the level of the stimulation affecting things. Is it always below the level of lesion, or do you ever?
Yes, it's always in the same spot. So it's always, so we put the stimulator in the where the stepping generator was, right? So we weren't so surprised about the standing. We were surprised that it happened the first day, that it was independent. So the original experiment was just to do stepping, because we were looking for stepping. So we weren't surprised about standing, because the standing sort of occurred there. But yeah, so it's all there. What's surprising is the heart. That's a little surprising.
So it's always below the level of lesion.
Yeah. Yeah, and regardless of where the injury is, it's always in the same spot. Okay. Sorry.
If you continue to raise the strength of the signal, the voltage,
yeah,
will you eventually just start firing the muscles below the levels? So are you backing off just below that?
Okay, so that's a good question. So yes, so it's complicated, of course, because you've got 1.2 million possibilities, right? Because you have frequencies and combinations or whatever. So you have, so it depends on how wide of a field you have, depends on the amplitude, how many anodes, cathodes you select, your amplitude, your frequency, all of those things, right? So, but yeah, so we can directly, we can directly drive a locomotor-like pattern. So we can I can set up a configuration and I can drive their legs to do this.
If you pump it up high.
Right. If I get a high enough amplitude. But that's not going to generate a stepping, then they can't control it with their intent, and the afferent information won't.
Right, you don't get a pattern. It's like overstimulating the heart. You get AFib.
Yeah, you're right. And I can drive them to do this, you know, but that doesn't look like a normal motor behavior.
Back off.
So
of
you
that
back
to the point
off.
where you aren't driving muscles.
That's right. And in fact, the configurations that actually work well to get good normal movement aren't actually even very close to those configurations, interestingly. But I can find those. You can drive those.
So I'm wondering, you know, because you were talking earlier about abandoning old concepts based
Yeah.
on what you're learning. And, you know, one of the old concepts was, you know, kind of what they call the dermoids, the dermatrust. You know, that different levels only really hit different parts of the body.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if maybe that's not true. Maybe there's actually pathways from above the lesion that really do go down there, but they're not enough on their own.
Well, I
to
think,
trigger.
yeah, so here's the thing.
Maybe that's what you're hitting.
Yeah, well, here's the other thing. I mean, I think that it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be aware of what's happening, but that doesn't, all these experiments that say, okay, if you zing here and you're aware of what's happening, that doesn't mean that the cortex controls everything. I mean, that's the problem. Just because you think about your toe doesn't mean that the cortex controls everything. And if you go back and really read these experiments carefully, there's not a single experiment that really provides evidence that the cortex controls movement. I mean, if you really look at the evidence, it's just we love our brains. I mean, we go, and then at the bottom it says, oh yeah, that supports the cortex control. No, it really doesn't. It really doesn't. So, and then but if you really look at it, I mean, look, that doesn't mean that, I mean, look, the basal ganglia has an influence, the midbrain does, but so does proprioception, so does the interneurons, all these things. So if you just think about it a little bit differently with an open mind, all of these things can influence it, but at the end of it, the interneurons, all this information comes in. So information from the cortex, there's very few fibers from the cortex that go directly to the interneurons. But information from the cortex goes to the basal ganglia, goes to the midbrain, goes to interneurons in the cervical cord, but then there's propriospinal neurons. There's reticular spinal, there's vestibular spinal, there's all these things converge on these interneurons in the lumbosacrospinal cord for locomotion, for example. Everything converges, but at the last end thing, it's the interneurons. So if you really think about it, all this information converges, and it's these interneurons that they're the last common pathway. So that's where the decision is made. But we can't wrap our heads around the spinal cord making a decision. It has to be our brain that makes the decision. But that's actually not logically possible because everything converges here. The decision has to be made here. But we can't accept that because we love our brain. Because we're so smart.
Well,
but logically,
we got to start the process.
Well, you don't know because, do we? No, because right now, if you think about it, do you? Because there are animals that locomote that don't have a cortex. So you don't have to have a cortex to move. Okay? Think about this. You have a baby in your arm. Have you ever dropped a baby and you didn't want to? Not all of us, but some of us have. Because you burned your hand or you fell down the stairs. Okay? You can move when you want to, but sometimes you move when you don't want to. So yes, you can move when you want to, but you can move without wanting to. So when we evolved, we get to move much more with more reason and more intent than any other species. But we don't always move because we want to. Sometimes we move for other reasons. How about when you're startled? And you jump and you're embarrassed because you jumped. You didn't really want to jump. It was embarrassing. Right?
Question on some of the secondary research. So good research, great talk. I would have some questions on the other benefits, secondary benefits. One kind of thing is bone strength increasing.
Yeah.
So how much do you think is directly from the stimulation versus just changing the function of the patient, such as more weight bearing?
Yeah, so it's just, so it builds on each other. Just like I think, I hate to say this, but I think a lot of what happens with spinal cord injury isn't the injury itself, it's what not that we do, like with malintent, but what ends up happening because they get in the wheelchair and they unload and they don't do anything and they don't exercise and they don't get out and they don't get a job because we don't give them jobs. They don't drive and they don't do things and all those things. So I think it's all interrelated, right? So it's probably very little to do with the few neurons they lost right here. It's all these things. And look, I'm a physiologist, so I was brought up on every system's interrelated to every other system. So I think it feeds on each other. And all those systems are the same thing. They're all disused. Look, their baroreceptors aren't used. Their baroreceptor now probably functions very differently. And that's what we're finding. So we're stimulating, we're able to use the stimulator without activating their muscles and get their blood pressures in a normal range. Ask me how. I'm not really sure. Now, I kind of know how. There's actually this great paper I found in 1976 where they did it with a cat. And apparently there's these afferents, I guess, or in humans too, in the lumbosympathetic fibers that we might be stimulating that are constricting and sending blood back to the heart. I mean, I'm guessing, but it makes sense. And we're able to keep it up there. And then it turns out that now, what also happens is they get orthostatic hypotension. So if they sit up, their blood pressure drops and they pass out. But now, even if we turn the stimulator off, that doesn't happen anymore, even with the stimulator off. So now, their system is changing again. So it looks like this is happening, and now they can regulate their blood pressure, temperature. So all these systems are plastic too.
Static hypertension should be sensitive, or receptor sensitivity, but that's more a scientific question for the patient. They don't care as long as they're getting better overall.
Not so much.
Right.
Not so much. Yeah. And then it's like, so I have to go, I had all these meetings with the FDA because, they're, and rightfully so, like, where have you ever had a study where someone says, well, I have one thing here and I have 84 outcomes? What are you talking about? What kind of scientist are you? I know, but my advisory board's making me do it. But of course, you want to look at the opportunity and you're trying to figure it out. And then you're like, well, and I want to collect all this. And they're like, why? Well, because I already missed 10 other things I didn't study here, and it's wrong with them. So I want to study it. I want to see what it is. So it's kind of unique. It's been pretty unique. So, yeah.
A couple of quick things. So is the training basically trying to make more connections so that signal gets amplified, and so after a time the threshold voltage also comes down? So that's one.
Well, so there wasn't really the intent. What I think is happening is, the nervous system's changing. There's lots of mechanisms that are changing. I think you're strengthening synapses. You're probably, you're changing dendritic trees. You're probably getting more dendritic spine. There's tons. You're probably getting more neurotransmitters. Things are changing. So then the whole circuit's changing, right? So you're changing that circuit. So, and and I think you're changing the supraspinal influence, and probably you're getting sprouting across the lesion. And so now that so the whole central state of excitability of the spinal cord is changing. So now that external influence, you don't need the same external influence anymore. So we have to adapt that. So it's not like we're trying to do any of those things. It's just we have to adapt that external influence based on what the intrinsic nervous system is doing. By trial and error and Samina's program now.
And I noticed that all your patients are quite young. Is there a reason for that? Why you didn't choose
Well,
patients? Or is it basically whatever you got?
No, so basically what ended up happening is we started with one person, and we wanted someone who was as healthy as possible, because we wanted to minimize the risk, right? Protection against risks, right? So we wanted someone really healthy, right? So we wanted someone with the best cardiovascular respiratory system we could find, who didn't have, so we started with that. And then when he moved voluntarily, and we wanted someone who was similar to him, which is really hard in spinal cord injury, really hard. Like, you cannot match anyone. So just a quick aside, we had those 4, and then our advisory board said, we want you to match those 4, okay? We want you to match them. We were just trying to match them in time since injury, age, and level of injury, okay? Those 3 things. We had a database of 4,000 people. Guess how many matches we had?
4?
0. 0. Okay, anyway. So what we did is we said, okay, we want someone who's an A, but is time since injury the same in level. And so then we picked our second person, and then we had an A and a B, and then we wanted to pick an A and a B. And so again, we tried to match time since injury and age to kind of keep them the same, because we were trying to learn. So that's why they were the same. And then we tried to match these 4 to match these 4. But we couldn't match them. We matched them as close as we could. So it's a very heterogeneous population. It's very difficult to match them. So, but now we're starting to expand out. We want to see, but it's really difficult to match this population.